Hello everyone, friends. You're on the channel One Survivor. Imagine the year is 1870. An ordinary official is left alone in the wilds of Yellowstone with only a couple of knives and a broken pair of binoculars. For 37 days, he will survive in a place where not even a hunter could make it. Watch this story until the end and you'll learn the secret of the most incredible survival in the heart of America. Let's go.
In the autumn of 1870, a man vanished in one of the most remote corners of the American West. He was not a trapper hardened by winters on the plains, nor a cavalry scout, nor one of the mountain men who seemed to grow out of the pines themselves. He was a bureaucrat, an aging tax assessor named Truman Everts, who stepped into the wilderness and stumbled into an ordeal that would stretch for 37 relentless days. This is his story, a tale of error and endurance, of small mercies and cruel luck, and of how a lost clerk helped carve a national park onto the map. Prologue, where maps went blank. On the paper maps of the day, vast swaths of the high plateau around the Yellowstone River were labeled with a single, coy word: unexplored. Saloon yarns filled the gaps. Travelers spoke of lakes that boiled, of forests turned to stone, of geysers that spat columns of water higher than church steeples. People laughed at such things, until the Washburn-Langford Doane expedition set out to see for themselves. Chapter 1. A paper man with a private restlessness. Truman Everts was 50, thin and bespectacled, a Vermonter who had spent the Civil War tending to the wounded rather than taking up arms. In Helena, Montana territory, he supervised ledgers and stamps for the newly minted Internal Revenue Service. He was a widower and the father of a teenager, Elizabeth, who kept his small house from feeling empty. He was competent. He was respected. He was also tired of being ordinary. That summer, while Washington reshuffled revenue districts, Everts found himself abruptly out of work for a spell, not dismissed so much as set adrift. Friends told him of the survey party departing Fort Ellis to chart the headwaters of the Yellowstone. 19 men, soldiers to keep order, a cook to keep spirits up, surveyors and judges to keep notes. Adventure enough to last a lifetime. Everts signed on, needing purpose as much as scenery. Among the volunteers was Warren Gillette, a young clerk sweet on Elizabeth. He carried a quiet hope: return from the expedition with a story brave enough to win a father's blessing. Chapter 2. The caravan heads south. Late August. The column rolled away from Fort Ellis, hooves and wheels beating the dust into a pale ribbon. They crossed open country where the wind never met a wall, then entered a land of timbered ridges and cold, swift water. Nights were sharp. Mornings smelled of resin and frost. Lieutenant Gustavus Doane, dapper even in the field, kept a meticulous journal. Nathaniel P. Langford, the territorial secretary, sketched and measured and preached the gospel of preservation around the campfire. Everts, nearsighted and earnest, rode a gentle bay mare and tried not to fall behind. He was fascinated by the sights: riverbanks that steamed as if they breathed, pools rimmed with colors no palate owned, elk turning to watch as if the men were the oddities. He was, to his surprise, happy. Chapter 3. A simple miscalculation. On September 9th, the party skirted the southern shore of a great cold lake. They would push west the next morning. The trail was choked with blowdown, a tangle of old storms. Everts' mare stumbled among the fallen trunks, and he, blinking behind spectacles fogged by breath and drizzle, drifted just far enough back to lose the line of men ahead. No matter, he told himself. He would make camp and catch up at breakfast. He had blankets, a carbine, fishing tackle, matches, and the confidence of a man who has never truly been alone outdoors. At dawn, he followed what he took to be the caravan's prince. His eyes, traitorous, read patterns where there were none. When he dismounted to study a scuffed patch of earth, the mare shied at something unseen, lurched and sprang away. In 3 heartbeats, she vanished into the timber with nearly all his kit: blankets, rifle, food, fire, hope, still cinched to the saddle. Everts shouted until his throat went raw. The forest took his voice and gave nothing back. Chapter 4. The First Cold. He inventoried what remained. An opera glass tucked in his coat, 2 butcher knives, a few coins and keepsakes. No shelter, no flint, no rations. He tightened his belt twice and walked. That night, frost crawled across the grass. He tried to sleep under a spruce, woke shaking and walked to warm himself. The lake, glassy in the starlight, looked close enough to touch and as distant as the moon. He told himself, aloud, that he'd rejoin the party before noon. Then he told himself again. Hunger arrived as a dull, steady knock. He chewed pine bark. He dug for cattail roots in the muck and gagged at their bitter mud. On the 3rd day, he spied pale shapes far off and ran, arms waving. Sails, rescue, only to find a pelican bobbing with solemn contempt. Alone he laughed. Then he cried. Chapter 5. A Circle of Eyes. On September 13th, a snow squall blew in sideways. By dusk, the timber turned to a dim cathedral, and the wind sang through its vaults. Somewhere in that grayness padded a mountain lion, silent on enormous feet. Everts felt the cat before he saw it. The prickle on the neck, the sense of being measured. He scrambled up a tree and hugged the trunk until his arms burned. All night he listened to the beast circle and circle below. At dawn it was gone. He climbed down with splinters in his palms and the careful movements of a man who knows his life weighs less than a cat's curiosity. Chapter 6. The hot springs country days blurred. He lost one knife to a crack between boulders, the other to a slip in slick mud. His boots split at the toes, his feet bled, then froze. Then, like a curtain lifting, the land changed. He came upon a basin of warm breath, a congregation of hot springs. The ground itself gave off a low hiss. Pools steamed in the chill air, some mild as a bath, some boiling and treacherous. Everts eased his swollen feet into a lukewarm runnel and groaned as feeling returned like fire. Near the pools grew wild thistle, stubborn rosettes of spines with pale, fibrous cores. He peeled the stalks with numbed fingers and chewed. They were bitter. They were life. He called the place his dining kettle and returned to it whenever his wandering looped him back. He pulled a pin from his vest, bent it against a rock into a hook, and unraveled part of his coat lining for a line. He fished the outflow of a spring and caught little, but the trying steadied his mind. With the convex lens of his opera glass, he gathered a wedge of cold sunlight until dry moss smoldered, then flamed. He had made fire. He wept where no one could see. Chapter 7. The Cost of Comfort. Even sanctuary had teeth. One night a geyser coughed without warning and threw a shimmering sheet over him. The water scalded his thigh the way only boiling water can, a pain so clean it stole his breath. He rolled in the cold gravel, keening. Later, dozing by his cherished coals, he woke to a wall of light. A gust had blown sparks into the brush. The forest was aflame, his doing. He staggered toward the lake, hair singeing, and splashed into the shallows while the fire raced away into the timber. In the morning, ash fell like a slow snow. He sat and watched it drift and felt very small. Chapter 8. The Mind's Last Tricks. Isolation began to unspool the careful man he had been. He addressed his legs and stomach as allies. "You and I," he told them, "will go a little farther today." In the eddying steam he saw acquaintances long dead, beckoning him down the shore with familiar, patient smiles. He nodded back, polite as ever, and kept moving. When storms pinned him, he built huts of branches and draped them with his shredded coat. Wolves paced the edge of the firelight, yellow eyes blinking and gone, blinking and gone. He guarded the ember he'd nursed from the lens as if it were a child, always certain the next rain would kill it, and with it his small claim on warmth and courage. Chapter 9. Men Who Searched. Back along the lakeshore, the expedition combed the timber. They lit signal fires, fired pistols at dusk, hacked notes into bark and tucked others into bottles wedged in forked branches. Warren Gillette begged to remain behind when Langford's main party moved on. With 2 soldiers, he kept vigil 3 days, calling Everts' name until his voice frayed. Wind carried their shouts the wrong way. Snow muffled the reports of their pistols. Somewhere not so far, a man warmed his hands over a thimble of coals and spoke to his own shins to keep from weeping. By late September, most accepted that Everts had either drowned or frozen. In his diary, Langford wrote the genteel epitaph of the age, that perhaps some hunter or Indian would someday find the sad evidence of his folly. Chapter 10. Lessons of Thistle. 30 days in, Everts' world had shrunk to steps and sips and stalks. The thistle, which country people elsewhere cursed as a weed, became his sacrament. He learned to split the stalk along its length and scrape the pith free with a sliver of bone. He learned to boil what he could in spring water until the bitterness leached, and to drink the broth as if it were stew. He learned, too, that food this thin kept one hovering at the edge, never falling, never rising. Once a songbird flitted too close. He snatched it by reflex, killed it in his fist, and ate it raw. Later, he shook with a fever that might have been guilt or simply meat for a starving gut. Chapter 13. The Last Miles. By mid-October, his burned thigh oozed and crusted. Each step pulled the wound open. He limped, then crawled, dragging the leg behind to save the skin from tearing. His spectacles had long since shattered. The world was a smear, shapes more idea than object. The ember he'd nursed for weeks guttered and died on a day of sleet. He carried the cold like a second body. On October 16th, emaciated to a boy's weight, he saw motion among the trees and, assuming another trick of the lonely brain, looked away. The motion resolved into 2 men. One in buckskins, rifle easy at his shoulder. The other, a lank figure bundled against the wind. "Are you Mr. Everts?" the buckskinned man called. The voice was wary, as if addressing a ghost. Everts tried to answer and made only a thread of sound. He nodded. He was, somehow, still himself. Chapter 14. The Men Who Found Him. The rescuer was Jack Baronet, a mountain man who had tallied more winters than most settlers had summers, and a companion whose name the papers forgot. They had come following rumor and the kind of instinct people call luck when it pans out. They bundled Everts in a buffalo robe and fed him sparingly, mindful that too much too soon can kill as surely as starvation. They ferried him to the warm huts at Mammoth Hot Springs, then by wagon over shivering miles to Bozeman. Doctors peered, prodded, muttered. Gangrene flirted with his toes. Fever made a map of roses on his cheeks. He did not die. Chapter 15. 37 Days of Peril. When he could sit and hold a pen, Everts dictated his account to the Helena Herald. He wrote with the exactness of a man accustomed to forms and attestations, and with a restraint that made the horrors land harder. He told of the cat's eyes at the edge of the firelight, the thistle that steadied his hands, the geyser that burned his thigh, the moment he learned sunlight could be a match. The article traveled farther than he ever had. People read it aloud in parlors back east and in bunkhouses along the Union Pacific. A clerk, of all people, had survived the most improbable trial, not by killing a bear with a Bowie knife or racing a storm on horseback, but by enduring. Chapter 16. A Park Takes Shape. Langford, whose zeal for preservation had been tempered by the memory of a man almost lost, carried the story to Congress. Doane spoke of the geyser basins in a voice that made the House picture steam. The nation, barely 5 years past tearing itself apart, liked the idea that it could set aside something grand and call it everyone's. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the act that created Yellowstone National Park, the first of its kind. The signatures did not credit a lost tax assessor, but his ghost walked the margins of the parchment. The hot springs that had saved him became curiosities for others to admire and, in time, protect. Chapter 17. Rough Edges on a Legend. Stories grow smoother as they roll downhill. The Everts tale has its burrs. When Baronet later stopped by to see the man he had saved, Everts received him briskly, as if interruptions annoyed him. Baronet, who never saw the reward he was promised because, technically, he had not found a body, left muttering that there were days he regretted not letting nature keep what it had nearly claimed. It was a mountain man's joke, half true. Everts himself was offered the superintendent's chair for the newborn park. He declined. Perhaps he recognized that the job belonged to someone who loved the field more than the file. Or perhaps he had finally learned to say no to the kinds of adventures that swallow a man whole. He took steadier work with the post office and lived until 1901, dying of pneumonia a long way from the hot pools that had once wrapped him in steam. Coda, the Ember. There is a moment in Everts' narrative that readers hurry past, the moment the opera glass lens finds its focus and a wisp of smoke twines from tinder. It seems small beside mountain lions and wildfires. But consider everything that came after. The long spiral of days that did not end in one last shiver depends on that heat. An ember is too humble to praise. You protect it. You feed it. You do not brag about it. You carry it as far as it will come, If you are lucky, it becomes a flame again when you need it most. Truman Everts' ember lasted long enough for two strangers to find him. The park it helped set in motion has lasted long enough for millions of strangers to find themselves. Thank you for listening to this story to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments what you think about it. See you in the new issue, friends.